The ridge rose sharply against the pale blue sky, jagged and unforgiving, as if it had been carved to test courage rather than reward it. Eliza urged her horse forward, unaware that one loose stone would change everything. The animal's hoof slipped, gravel skittered, and suddenly the world tipped sideways. Eliza screamed as she was thrown from the saddle, her body tumbling down the rocky slope. Pain tore through her ankle when she struck the ground, sharp enough to steal her breath. The sky spun above her, then stilled, leaving only the sound of her own frightened breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. She tried to move. The moment she put weight on her leg, agony flared and forced her back onto the dirt. Panic crept in, cold and suffocating. The trail was empty. No towns nearby. No voices calling her name. The ridge felt like a prison now, silent and merciless. Eliza pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting tears, knowing that if no one came, the night would finish what the fall had started. Footsteps broke the silence. At first she thought it was her imagination, born from fear and pain. But the sound grew clearer, slow, steady, real. A man appeared through the dust, tall and broad-shouldered, leading a chestnut horse. He wore a weathered coat and a hat pulled low, his face marked by sun and hardship. His eyes widened when he saw her sprawled against the rocks. He moved quickly, kneeling beside her. "Don't try to get up," he said, his voice calm but firm, like someone used to being obeyed. Eliza looked up at him, trembling, relief washing over her so strongly it almost hurt. "My ankle," she whispered. "I can't stand." He examined the injury with careful hands, tearing a strip from his bandana to bind it. Every touch was gentle, respectful, as though he understood how close she was to breaking. When he finished, he hesitated only a moment before sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back. "What are you doing?" she asked, startled. "Getting you out of here," he replied simply. As he lifted her, Eliza felt the strength in him, solid and sure, and for the first time since the fall, the fear loosened its grip. She clutched his coat as he carried her down the ridge, each step deliberate, protective. The mountains watched in silence as the cowboy bore her weight without complaint, his jaw set with determination. "Why would you help me?" she asked softly, her head resting against his shoulder. He didn't look down, but his voice was steady. "Because leaving you here ain't an option." And as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Eliza realized that the stranger carrying her was no longer just a cowboy. He was her only hope. Caleb's cabin stood at the edge of the trees, rough-cut logs stacked with care, smoke curling softly from the chimney like a promise of shelter. When he pushed the door open, the scent of pine and firewood wrapped around them. He laid Eliza gently on the narrow bed, moving as if she were something precious, something he was afraid to damage. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, but inside the cabin, warmth slowly chased away the cold fear that had followed her down the mountain. Caleb fetched water and a small tin of salve, his movements quiet and practiced. He knelt beside her, untying the bandage he had made earlier to check her ankle. It was swollen and bruised, but his hands were steady as he cleaned and wrapped it again. Eliza watched him, noticing the scars on his knuckles, the way his jaw tightened when she winced, as though he felt her pain too. No man had ever tended to her with such care, without expectation or demand. The storm arrived before nightfall. Rain drummed against the roof, and thunder rolled through the valley, sealing them inside the cabin together. Caleb stoked the fire while Eliza rested, the crackling flames casting golden light across the room. Time seemed to slow, stretched thin by the quiet. Eventually words found their way into the space between them. "You live out here all alone?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "Been that way a long time." There was something final in his tone, a weight behind it that told her he didn't choose the loneliness so much as accept it. As the hours passed, they shared small pieces of themselves, where she came from, the long road that led him to the mountains. The losses neither spoke about directly, but both carried deep inside. Each confession softened the distance between them. At night the fire burned low and shadows danced across the walls. Eliza lay awake, listening to the storm and to Caleb's steady breathing from the chair near the hearth. She felt safe, yet strangely restless, aware of him in a way she hadn't expected. When she shifted, a quiet gasp escaped her, and Caleb was instantly at her side, Concern etched into his face. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Not like before," she replied, meeting his eyes. In that look, something fragile and powerful passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a pull neither was ready to name. Days followed in the same gentle rhythm. Caleb brought her food, helped her walk, and listened when she spoke. Eliza laughed more than she had in years, surprised by how easily he drew it from her. In the solitude of the cabin, guarded hearts began to open, and without realizing it, both were warming themselves by a fire far more dangerous than the one burning on the hearth. The morning Eliza could walk without leaning on Caleb's arm arrived quietly, almost cruel in its calm. Sunlight spilled through the cabin window, painting the wooden floor in soft gold, while the mountains stood tall and indifferent beyond the door. Her ankles still ached, but it no longer bound her to the bed or to him. The realization settled heavy in her chest as she watched. Caleb tightened the straps on her saddle, his movements careful, distant, as if space could make leaving easier. Neither of them spoke at first. The only sounds were leather creaking and the low snort of the horse. Eliza stepped outside, the cool air filling her lungs, and knew with aching certainty that if she rode away now, something irreplaceable would be lost. The thought of returning to a life that no longer included him felt unbearable. "I don't want to go," she said at last. Caleb's hands stilled. He didn't turn around. "You should," he replied after a moment. "This place, it ain't meant for someone like you." She moved closer, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders. "You carried me down that ridge when you didn't have to. You opened your home. You saw me at my weakest." Her voice shook. "Don't tell me I don't belong here." He finally faced her, conflict written across his weathered features. "This life takes more than it gives," he said quietly. "I've lost too much already." Eliza reached for his hand, her fingers sliding into his rough palm. "So have I," she whispered. "But somehow here with you it doesn't hurt as much." The silence that followed was thick with everything they'd left unsaid. Caleb looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a wounded stranger, but as a woman who had changed something deep inside him. He thought of the weight of her in his arms on the ridge, of the way her laughter had filled the cabin, of the emptiness that would return if she left. "I carried you because I thought you needed me," he said, voice low. "Turns out, I needed you too." Tears gathered in Eliza's eyes as he pulled her into his arms, holding her not as a burden but as a choice. The mountains bore witness as the cowboy, who had lived for nothing but survival, chose love instead. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and real. Under the wide Wild West sky, Eliza understood that hope hadn't come from being rescued. It came from two broken souls finding the courage to stay and to build a future together where the ridge had once threatened to end everything.